Ask most people if they feel loved in their relationships, and they'll pause longer than you'd expect. Not because the answer is obviously no, but because the question opens something they haven't quite looked at directly. And when the answer comes, it's often something like, I feel provided for, I feel taken care of, I feel needed, which is not nothing. But it isn't quite the same as feeling loved. And most people know the difference, even if they've never said it out loud. This video is for anyone who has a nagging sense that something is a little off in their relationship, not dramatically wrong, not obviously broken, just not quite what they thought it would feel like. And you can't always name it because that person is there and things are largely functional, and yet something is missing. We're going to look at what that something often is, where it comes from, and why it's so easy to miss. We'll get into the difference between caring for someone and actually being with them, and why friendship, especially inside romantic partnerships, matters more than most people realize. We'll look at how loneliness can quietly distort what we think we're feeling, and we'll close with some concrete places to start. These patterns show up across all kinds of relationships with all kinds of people, and that's exactly how we're looking at it here. And if you specifically identify as queer or are in an ethically non-monogamous relationship, there's a second video in this series that looks at how these same dynamics show up slightly differently in those contexts. The motivations are often similar, but the experience has its own specific texture. Look for that video in the collection later this week, or if you're viewing this video sometime in the future, it will be linked at the end of this video. If you are new here, welcome. I am Cyndi Darnell, sex and relationship therapist working with all kinds of people in all kinds of relationship configurations all over the world. This channel is where we have the conversations many of us have in our heads, but not out loud. Here, we talk about relationships, desire, intimacy, connection, friendships, emotion, grief, and what gets in the way. If that's what you're here for, you are in the right place. So let's get started. So let's begin by looking at the scaffolding we mistake for building. Because most of us have inherited a set of ideas about what love looks like in practice. Sacrifice, protect, provide, perform. These words carry a lot of weight, and in certain contexts, they describe genuinely loving acts, sitting with someone through a medical crisis, holding things together during a hard financial season, or showing up consistently when someone needs you to, and these things absolutely matter. But what I want to examine is what happens when these actions become the definition of love rather than the expression of something deeper. Because when that happens, we stop building relationships and start building roles. And roles, no matter how well executed, are not the same as people. The distinction feels a little abstract until you're inside it. And then it feels like the difference between being known and being serviced, being seen and being managed. A lot of people live inside that gap for years before they can name it, and some never quite do. Now let's look at where these patterns come from and who tends to carry them the most. Unsurprisingly, patriarchy plays a role in this, because patriarchy is an operating system, and it's one that most of us are still running, even if we are unaware of it. And what it encodes very efficiently is that love is demonstrated through function, that men provide and protect, that women nurture and manage. And if the performance is consistent, that is a good relationship. That's considered a successful relationship. And this coding runs deep and it starts early, because boys are often taught, not in explicit lessons, but in the texture of daily life, that competence is care, and that doing things for people is the only acceptable channel for affection. By the time he's in an adult relationship, the translation is already firmly in place. I love you becomes I will handle things for you. Many people in my practice describe loving their partners with real intensity, but having almost no vocabulary for it beyond action. I work long hours so they don't have to worry. I show up when I'm needed. Isn't that love? The honest answer is, well, yes, partly. But the part that's missing is the part that can actually be felt as intimacy. Women, particularly in heterosexual relationships, are often trained in parallel but different patriarchal performances. Emotional labor as devotion, anticipating needs as love, shrinking, softening, accommodating, managing the emotional atmosphere of a household, and calling that partnership. A woman who expresses her needs directly gets called demanding. A woman who consistently puts herself last gets called selfless, which somehow still, in 2026, reads as a compliment. She does it because it often works, in the sense that it keeps things calm and it keeps people close, until she's exhausted and invisible, and the resentment is so old that she cannot remember even where it started. These patterns show up across all kinds of relationships with all kinds of people. The specific costumes change, but the underlying logic doesn't, because this was never really only about gender. It was always about how we learned to make ourselves acceptable, to earn belonging, to stay safe inside a relational worldview, and adaptive patterns, however intelligent their origins, tend to follow us into contexts where they were never meant to apply. So let's look at when sacrifice and provision are actually useful. Because sacrifice is real and long-term relationships, they require it. There are genuine moments where you choose the relationship over your immediate preference. Taking a job you didn't want because it kept the family in a city that mattered to your partner. Sitting through a crisis at real cost to yourself. Choosing to stay during a really hard time in your relationship because leaving would be easier for you, but worse for the people that you love. These are meaningful acts of love expressed through genuine cost, and they matter. Provision, financial, logistical, emotional, that's also real, it's necessary, and it's chronically undervalued. The invisible labor of keeping a household and a family functional is the architecture of a shared life. But just calling it logistics misses how much care is embedded within it. So the problem isn't sacrifice or provision. It's when they become the entire structure, the floor, the walls, the ceiling, rather than one part of something much larger. Because there's a meaningful difference between setting aside your own needs because the situation genuinely calls for it, and having no access to your own needs at all because self-erasure has become your whole identity in the relationship. Sacrifice from genuine choice feels different than sacrifice driven by fear. Fear of abandonment. If I stop giving, they'll leave. Fear of worthlessness. My value here depends entirely on what I can contribute. Fear of conflict. It's easier to give in than to need something. The act looks identical from the outside, and the internal experience is so completely different, and over time, so is the outcome. Fear-based sacrifice accumulates resentment, quietly, often unconsciously, and resentment is one of the more reliable predictors of relational erosion. So now let's look at roles versus humans and what this actually looks like. A role-based relationship rarely involves obvious conflict. The logistics work, the structure holds, things look fine, sometimes genuinely good, but there's a particular kind of loneliness inside it that's hard to justify because you can't point to it. The person's there and they're doing the things, but you don't feel met. You feel maintained. And depth was never quite established as part of the structure. Nobody decided against it. It just never happened. And now there's an unspoken agreement that it won't. Someone tries occasionally to bring something tender or uncertain into the room and finds that it lands awkwardly. It gets solved rather than witnessed. It gets redirected to something practical. After enough of those moments, they stop trying, not out of resentment, but out of learned resignation. This isn't what this relationship is for. And they take part of themselves elsewhere. A friend, a journal, a therapist, while their partner remains unaware that anything is actually being withheld. Physical intimacy follows the same logic. It becomes choreographed. Not unpleasant, sometimes genuinely tender, but operating at a removed level, sex that functions without the element of contact that makes it meaningful or exciting, because genuine erotic presence requires a degree of nakedness that role-based relating doesn't have much room for. So what you end up with is two people performing in parallel, often loyal, often kind, often genuinely fond of each other. The caring is real, but it's expressed almost entirely through doing, and doing is not the same as being with someone. It doesn't produce the kind of experience of being known, of having someone interested in the complicated, unresolved, still becoming version of you, rather than the version that reliably fulfills its function. And this can last decades without either person being miserable enough to change it. It's only when something disrupts the structure, a health crisis, a child leaving, a redundancy, an affair, that the question surfaces. Who are we to each other without all of this? Sometimes the answer is richer than expected, but sometimes it's much thinner. So let's look now at friendship, which is the thing most romantic relationships are missing. And when I say friendship inside a romantic partnership, I don't mean the word, because the word gets used a lot in wedding speeches and then it's kind of forgotten. I mean the actual qualities of friendship, genuine curiosity about who this person is becoming, not just who they've been. Comfort of being known imperfectly. The comfort of being known imperfectly. The ability to be bored together without the silence becoming a problem. The capacity to disagree without the relationship feeling threatened. The Gottman's research consistently found that friendship quality, where the partners genuinely liked each other, know each other's inner worlds, or find each other interesting, is a more reliable predictor of relationship satisfaction than passion, conflict, or communication technique. Which sounds kinda obvious until you notice how rarely it's actually prioritized. Because most of us approach relationships with urgency, romantic urgency first, and then logistical urgency. And the friendship kind of gets deferred. We assume that it will emerge naturally from shared time, but often it doesn't, because shared time is not the same as genuine contact. You can live with someone for 20 years and remain a stranger to the inner life they're carrying around. This isn't just a dramatic failure. It's usually just what happens when two people build a life together while forgetting to keep building a relationship. Real curiosity about a long-term partner requires something counterintuitive. Accepting that you don't fully know them, that they are still in motion, still carrying things that you haven't seen. And that can feel destabilizing when you've built a whole life on the assumption of knowing someone. But certainty tends to flatten people, and flattened people are harder to stay genuinely connected to. Platonic friendships outside the romantic partnership carry more weight in this conversation than they usually get credit for. Because when the romantic partnership becomes someone's only real emotional relationship, everything that once distributed across a broader network, fun, support, understanding, companionship, all of that collapses onto one person. And that's an enormous amount of pressure and tends to leave one partner overwhelmed and the other perpetually underserved. Friendship, maintained with some intentionality, is not supplementary, it's load-bearing. So now let's pivot slightly and look at loneliness, anxious attachment, and what we mistake for connection in those times. Loneliness is not about being alone. It's a felt absence of meaningful contact, the sense of being present in your life without quite landing in it. The nervous system registers it as a genuine threat, which means that when something relieves it, even partially, that relief can feel like love. Anxious attachment intensifies this. The anxiously attached nervous system is calibrated to monitor for distance and inconsistency. It's in a mild state of vigilance most of the time. When someone consistently available appears, the relief can be profound enough that it reads as falling in love. And sometimes it is. But sometimes what's happened is more specific. The particular pain of an anxious attachment has been soothed, and the soothing is being attributed to the person rather than the state. People with anxious attachment often describe their most intense relationships as their most loving, when frequently what made them intense was the uncertainty. The nervous system's chronic not quite knowing produces a neurochemical mix that can closely mimic profound connection. And when stability finally arrives, it can feel like boredom or like settling or that spark leaving because safety is unfamiliar enough to be misread. This is one mechanism that keeps people returning to relationships that hurt them and feeling oddly flat in ones that are genuinely kind. And it's not masochism. It's a nervous system that learnt to associate love with a particular kind of emotional weather and struggles to recognize warmth when the atmosphere finally becomes stable. So there's a few things worth distinguishing here. Attentiveness is not attunement. Someone can be intensely focused on you while primarily managing their own anxiety rather than being genuinely curious about you. Attunement is slower. It's being noticed accurately, the way a good friend reads something in you before you've named it. And it can't really be performed. Physical intensity, that's not intimacy. Two people collapsing into each other quickly can feel like a profound connection, and sometimes it becomes one, but often what it produces is a level of enmeshment that's hard to tell apart from intimacy until friction arrives. And then shared pain, that's not shared values. Bonds formed under stress are real, but they're not always the same as bonds that sustain a life once things settle. If you're enjoying this video and it's landing for you, please hit that like and subscribe so it reaches more people. Your help here really, really makes a difference. So let's think about what to do instead, especially from the beginning of a relationship or as part of some repair after a conflict. Some concrete places to start, not as a formula, but as genuine entry points, particularly if you're early in a relationship or rebuilding one. So the first is slowing down enough to distinguish what you're bringing from what you're performing. Not, am I a good partner when I do this? The fixing, the providing, the sacrifice. Is it coming from genuine care or from anxiety about what happens if I don't? And you don't need a clean answer here. The asking itself starts to shift something. The second is building your capacity for platonic intimacy, because that is a skill that most adults are under-practiced in. If your only close relationships are romantic, your emotional range will be extremely compressed. The vulnerability, the curiosity, and the playfulness that sustain good friendship are the same capacities that sustain long-term romantic partnerships, and they need to be built somewhere. The third is learning to be curious about someone rather than impressed by them. An early attraction tends to focus on what a person does, their competence, their confidence, their credentials. Genuine liking focuses on who they are when those things are stripped back. What do they find funny? What are they afraid of? What do they want their life to actually feel like? And can they sit with uncertainty? Can you? The fourth is noticing when you're choosing a role and sitting with why. Roles in relationships are not random. They're usually a response to something, a history, a fear, a lesson learned early about what makes you acceptable or necessary to another person. And some of these roles might be familiar to you. The fixer, whose value depends on making problems disappear. The provider, whose love has collapsed entirely into function because they learnt that presence alone was not enough. The caretaker, who anticipates everyone's needs before their own are acknowledged because need once felt dangerous to them. The strong one, so identified with holding things together that softness for them maybe feels like failure. Or the entertainer, who keeps things light because depth was never really welcomed. The reliable one, always available but quietly erased. Most people recognize themselves in at least one of these. The why is where it gets personal. Sometimes we take a role because we don't know that there's another option. It's what love looked like growing up, and it got absorbed as the definition. Sometimes because it worked once, and the nervous system filed it away as a strategy. Or sometimes because our own inner life feels too complicated to inhabit, and functioning is simply tidier than feeling. And sometimes it's because the person in front of us is more comfortable with a function than a human, and we sense that, and so we adapt. But none of this makes someone a bad partner. It usually just makes them a frightened one. The question worth returning to is not, am I doing enough? Role players almost always are. But is what I'm doing bringing me closer to this person, or is it keeping us at a manageable distance? So what shifts in a role-based relationship when something does shift is rarely about doing more or doing differently. It's usually about allowing something, showing up without a function, sitting with someone without an agenda, being uncertain in front of another person rather than immediately competent. Building a structure that works is not that hard. Learning to be human inside of it, that tends to be the entire work. If this is landing for you and you want to go further, there are a few ways that we can work together. My book, Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, is a good place to start for folks who like reading. And if you're looking for something a little more personal, I offer coaching and counseling with individuals, couples, and polycules all over the world. If you'd like a structured path, you can move through in your own time. My online courses are built for exactly that. Links to all of those things are below. And as always, I'm here to remind you that this stuff isn't simple and it doesn't need to be. But I do think it is worth staying with. Thank you for being here. Thank you for liking. Thank you for subscribing. And let me know how this resonates for you. What roles do you take on? And what insights did you get from watching this video? What made you think, oh my goodness, that's me? Share this far and wide. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you in the next one.